We saw a whole bunch of things, right? From changing the lyrics to the songs they sang in music class, not getting rid of the arts, but changing things substantially, changing the food that they eat, changing gym class, getting rid of underperforming kids, right? And teaching them basically the answers that they might be using. Now, while some of those things, like getting rid of the underperformers, are clear cut, but just like giving them actual answers, some of the things like integrating curriculum in terms of language arts and music, I don't know. That's a little grayer area, and I think people would fall into different camps on that. Popham has given you these two guiding principles about whether or not anything that you're doing is either ethical or unethical. And those were professional norms and educational defensibility. And I don't think I need to go into more detail about what those are. I think Popham does a really good job. He also lists then 5 different ways that people tend to prepare students to take a standardized test. Previous form preparation, which is just giving them older versions of that same test. Current form preparation, giving them the current test to practice on. Generalized test-taking preparation, educated guessing, process of elimination, drawing analogies, managing your workload, your stress level, and all that other stuff. Same format preparation, mirroring what the test does. Basically, if I have an essay exam, I make essay standardized test, I make all my classroom assessments into essays. If the test is multiple choice format that I'm trying to get them ready for, well, then I change my practice in class to all multiple choice. And of course, the problem with this is I negate the idea that each type of assessment is limited, and I should make sure that I use multiple methods of assessment in order to get at the truth. Finally, I have my varied format preparation, which is where I basically give them practice with all different types of questions, making sure that they are ready to answer whatever kind of question format they come across. In terms of whether or not he thinks these things are actually educationally defensible and in line with professional ethics or norms, he says that giving previous forms of the exam, old exams that may have expired, he says no and no. For current form, he says no, no. Generalized test taking, yes, yes. Same format, yes, no. And varied format, yes, yes. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how he says previous form and same format are not educationally defensible. If you look at the things that we do in our class, I usually give you a version of the types of questions I'm going to be asking you on the exam, because I believe that if I don't give you some clue about what you're doing, you won't necessarily do as well as you can, because I understand that the assessment is limited. I'm asking you to do things in kind of an inauthentic way, using specific words that maybe you haven't heard before, in a specific format that may not be necessarily the best way to get the highest quality, but it's the one I'm choosing because of time restraints and costs and dollars and so on. One of the assumptions that Papa makes is that when I look at somebody's ability and I compare that to the test score, those two things are equal, right? So ability equals test score, and that's the basic assumption he's working with. Now, when we look at previous form, right, he's saying that if I don't give somebody a heads up basically as to the kinds of questions I'm going to ask, and the number of questions and the conditions under which I'm going to ask them and how long I'm going to ask those questions, that I will get something like this. That some people will perform over their ability, some will perform under, but overall, people will do pretty much what their ability dictates they should do. I would argue, though, that in many cases, what you have going on, if you don't have any kind of real preparation and you are putting somebody into a very strange, inauthentic format, whether it's computer-based or paper pencil, where you're filling bubbles into, circles for the next 45 minutes or several hours, if you have different sections back to back and so on, or clicking things on a mouse. Using a mouse on a computer, which, these days is getting less and less frequent. Most people use trackpads on laptops, and people are really getting used to touch interfaces. So you have this interface activity, especially for kids who don't have computers at home at all, right, of navigating computer-based technology. You have this high stress environment where everybody's kind of watching you. People have been talking about it, you've been training for it, and that might impact your performance as well. But you usually, I think, have to recognize that when I'm trying to measure something about somebody, the way that I measure it is not going to be 100% accurate. It's limited. And if we recognize that, I think that our major purpose is to make it so that I can add something to it so that this situation doesn't happen, that the test isn't getting in the way of me measuring what you actually can or can't do. And we've talked a little bit about the EdTPA, and I think that this is an assessment like that, that if you gave the EdTPA to a really, really, really good teacher, or a bunch of really, really good teachers, some would do well on it and others would fail miserably. Now, if this EdTPA is trying to really assess teacher quality, right, I don't think that people who do things naturally or in a roundabout way and do them very well necessarily can talk and explain what they're doing. Much in the way that I think many championship athletes can't really break down what they're doing or how they're doing it. They just do it. And when we talk about, the things that we do to build rapport with students and to build relationships, I don't know if everyone can talk about that at the same level of skill. And the NTPA is asking us to talk about it in a very specific way, in very specific terms, in one specific framework. And just like I don't think some of the best teachers could actually describe well what they're doing, just like the best athletes can't describe what they're doing, coaches who can break things down, right, and can talk about what they're doing and how things should be done, don't necessarily make the best athletes. And it's usually the case, right, that coaches aren't the best pros and that pros aren't the best coaches, right? And it may be the case that the best teachers don't necessarily have the ability to really explain what they're doing unless we give them some practice and we supplement it and have them talk about it. So when we do look at the test score, it does actually reflect what their ability is. Now, when I'm talking about previous form preparation, I think that previous form, and this is where I disagree with Popham, I think that previous form is appropriate. Insofar as you don't give questions that could be on the test. So if there are old forms of a test that contain some of the questions that might be on the new test, absolutely not, out of bounds. I don't know how you get your hands on those anyway. Maybe buy them from somebody in a dark alley, I don't know. Probably online somewhere too. But if I just am getting them ready to, building their mental stamina, I'm worried about that because in our curriculum, or if I'm worried that this whole multiple choice thing, because I have a curriculum that is totally project based and super, authentic assessments and instruction, and we don't give multiple choice tests because our class sizes are small, we have good resources, and we really believe in putting our education into the real world. Well, a multiple choice test is going to cause a ton of problems. So insofar as I can make it so the test itself is not a hindrance to identifying what people can and can't do, previous form, in my mind, is appropriate. Now, the same thing goes for the same format. Oops. For the same format right here. People do it. He says it's not educationally defensible, but that, again, is going from the assumption that we are working under a situation. There we go. Working under a situation like this and not like this. And again, I think that if we don't typically give multiple choice tests, and I want to give my students practice at asking just multiple choice questions, and I dedicate, or I change, modify my assessments to talk about how to approach those things, just so I make it more like this, well, then I think it's completely appropriate. As far as current form, never good. You can't give people a test beforehand. Um, and varied format, he says, is fine in all cases too. But you just have to make sure that when you are asked to do things, and you will be asked to do things in your school, in your classes, and maybe just by yourself, you'll think, should I do this or shouldn't I do it? I think these two principles are a good place to start. But always realize the difficulties that are inherent in assessments and make sure that whatever you are doing in terms of your assessment practice aren't limiting the view you have of your students' abilities, but really giving you the fullest picture. And if that requires a little additional training to get the interface down, right, the test taking interface, well, then by all means do that. If you have to give them practice tests like I give you that are similar or almost exactly like the same format of the actual exam, or if you just need to give them some practice in that particular format of answering or asking the right kinds of questions, go ahead and do that. If you have any questions, let me know.